Tonight we're stepping back into a time when the world was still a map of mysteries and most of the white space at the top was labeled something like "Here be death by hypothermia." The year is somewhere in the 19th century, and yes, you are about to climb aboard a wooden vessel bound for the Arctic. The sea smells sharp, the deck sways, and every part of you already wishes your bed back home could magically appear in the cabin you're about to occupy. You're here to explore, chart, and survive, though between us, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and the local time in the comments so we can see how far around the world tonight's voyage will drift. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You drag your sea chest up the gangplank, though drag feels generous, since it's more like you're attempting to pull a stubborn boulder with a handle. It's made of thick canvas stretched over a frame of seasoned wood, its brass fittings dulled by salt air and time. Inside is the curated chaos of everything you're counting on to keep you alive, sane, and maybe even slightly stylish in the frozen wild. A 19th century Arctic explorer's chest is a bit like a modern carry-on bag, if that bag also had to store your entire personality, your survival kit, and half your pantry. At the top are your clothes, the ones you don't trust to get tossed into the communal pile below deck. Woolen socks that could stand on their own if you left them unattended, a couple of knitted scarves from someone who still writes you letters, and a pair of gloves so stiff from past trips they might be legally classified as small shields. Beneath that, a rolled-up sweater you keep meaning to darn but haven't because the hole has taken on a character feature status. Then there's the keepsake pouch. In here you've stashed a lock of hair tied with ribbon, a coin rubbed smooth from being in your palm on every departure, and a little wooden carving of a fox given to you by an Inuit trader on your last expedition. Historians still argue whether these sorts of talismans were purely sentimental or if sailors really believed they could ward off bad weather. You're not taking any chances. Next to the keepsakes are the more questionable items. A tin of infallible tooth powder that smells faintly of burnt cinnamon, an unlabeled bottle of medicinal brandy that you're definitely not sharing, and a small pouch of dried herbs someone swore could be brewed into tea for vigor. You have your doubts about the tea and the brandy, but you pack them anyway. Tucked in the side compartment are your eating utensils, which, after years of service, are less cutlery set and more survivors of an ongoing battle with rust. Your spoon has a dent big enough to collect rainwater, and your knife is sharp in exactly one spot. There's also a fork, though you're not entirely sure why. It's not like hardtack yields to polite table manners. Down at the bottom, wrapped in old shirts for padding, you've hidden your small stash of sugar cubes and a precious tin of loose-leaf tea. This is your insurance policy against the days when the sea, the cold, and the company are all conspiring against you. You can imagine it now, huddled in your bunk, a tin cup in hand, steam curling in the lamplight, pretending for a moment that the ice outside isn't plotting to crush the hull. The chest isn't just storage, it's a bit of a theatre prop for the other crew members. Everyone notices what you haul aboard. The captain eyes the heft of it, probably calculating how much space you're taking. The new cabin boy stares openly, trying to guess which things are weapons, which are comforts, and which are both. In the cramped quarters of Arctic exploration, your possessions aren't private, they're part of the ship's collective mood board. One quirky detail you notice while unpacking for the first night: your chest still smells faintly of pine tar and lavender. The pine tar's from sealing the wood against damp, the lavender was a hopeful touch from someone who thought it would keep moths away. Now it just makes your sweaters smell like a carpenter's garden. It's oddly comforting until you realize it's the last pleasant scent you'll encounter for weeks. As the ship creaks under the strain of a fresh swell, you kneel beside the open chest and think about the explorers before you. Some kept journals of every item they packed, noting down each spoon, each sock, as if documenting them would somehow guarantee they'd make it back. Others, especially in the earlier days, treated packing like a competitive sport. There's a record of one crew member bringing along a set of porcelain teacups for civility. That man lasted 3 weeks before the cups went overboard, casualties of a storm. Your own chest feels like a compromise between optimism and experience. Too much optimism and you'd be hauling frivolities like chessboards and collapsible writing desks. Too much experience and you'd leave out even the spare socks because what's the point? Instead, you've balanced the two, packing enough to keep your spirits from dipping below freezing, but not so much that the chest becomes an anchor in the wrong sense. By the time you've finished, the deck bell rings for evening mess, and you give the chest one last pat before securing it shut with the brass latch. There's a little click as it locks, and you can't help but think it sounds final, like sealing away a piece of your old life until you reach land again. Or, in less romantic terms, until you've eaten through all the sugar cubes and worn every pair of socks twice over. As you straighten up, the cold air sneaks in through your collar. You're not even in Arctic waters yet, but it's a reminder of why you're here, why the chest is packed the way it is, and why every explorer, past and present, has a ritual with their gear. Some rituals are about superstition, others are about control in a place where almost nothing can be controlled. The ship lists slightly as the tide shifts, the lanterns swinging just enough to make the shadows dance over your chest. You step away, already picturing the moment weeks from now when you'll rummage through it in the dark, your fingers brushing the fox carving or that stubborn dented spoon, each item a reminder of home, of decisions made in the warm, and of why you dragged this unwieldy thing aboard in the first place. You fish out the first layer from your chest, a thick, scratchy wool shirt, and start the slow process of becoming your own portable insulation unit. Out here, the layering game isn't about style points, it's about whether you'll be able to wiggle your fingers in the morning. First comes the base layer, long underwear so coarse it could double as sandpaper, then a shirt that smells faintly of lanolin from the sheep it once hugged. Over that, another layer of wool, heavier and darker, the kind that feels like it weighs a pound more after absorbing a single snowflake. The next garment is seal fur, stitched together by someone whose skill you silently admire every time you don it. The fur is soft to the touch but dense enough to hold in the body heat you're desperately producing in the Arctic's bite. Historians still argue whether explorers preferred seal over reindeer for this middle layer. Some swore by reindeer's warmth-to-weight ratio, others insisted seal was more water-resistant. You wear seal because it's what you could barter for, and frankly, you're not turning down anything that keeps the wind from finding your ribs. There's a particular awkwardness to these clothes. Modern hikers talk about freedom of movement, but in your get-up, freedom is a distant dream. You waddle more than walk, your joints protesting every bend like they're auditioning for an opera of creaks. And yet, there's a strange reassurance in the bulk. The layers are your armor against the world's most patient predator, cold. As you wrestle into the outer trousers, thick wool lined with more fur, you think about the men who came before you. In the mid-1800s, Sir John Franklin's doomed expedition left behind clothing so heavy when frozen that it could practically stand upright without a wearer. Arctic fashion in those days wasn't about looking sharp, it was about not becoming sharp, as in sharp-edged ice sculpture. Your socks are double-layered, inner ones of fine wool, outer ones thick and itchy enough to make your calves itch just from looking at them. The boots are sealskin again, this time stitched so tight they squeak faintly when you walk on dry boards. On the outside, they've been smeared with fish oil, a trick learned from Inuit hunters to keep the moisture out. It works, up to a point. The point being about 3 days in, when your boots start smelling like a dockside fish market on a warm afternoon. Gloves are next, but not the neat, flexible kind you'd find in a shop today. These are mittens, 2 layers, one wool, one fur, that make you look like you've grafted tiny shaggy animals to your hands. They're great for warmth, terrible for tying knots or flipping pages. You've learned to clench and point in awkward pantomime instead of trying to gesture like a civilized person. And then there's the headgear. You've got a knitted wool cap that pulls down low over your ears, and over that, a sealskin hood attached to your parka. Once that's in place, you have roughly the same field of vision as someone peering through a letterbox slot. The payoff is that your face stays protected from windburn, frostbite, and the kind of cold that makes your teeth ache inside your jaw. Beneath the humor of this routine is a sobering truth. In the Arctic, clothes aren't optional extras, they're the thin, fraying line between you and a silent, frozen oblivion. A quirky tidbit you remember reading once: some explorers carried extra scarves not to wear, but to wrap around the handles of tools so bare skin wouldn't stick to the metal in sub-zero temperatures. You've adopted that trick, though your extra scarf also serves as an impromptu nap pillow during rare warm spells. The last step in the layering ritual is fastening the parka. It's long, heavy, and lined with fur that still smells faintly of the animal's last swim. You tug it closed with toggles, no buttons out here. Buttons are tiny frostbite traps. The sleeves are slightly too long, intentionally, so you can hide your hands inside during sudden gusts. By the time you're done, your profile in the lantern light looks less like intrepid explorer and more like particularly puffy bear. Once dressed, you do the habitual bounce on your heels to settle the layers into place, then the slow turn of the head to check for gaps. The Arctic wind is like a jealous ex, it will find any weakness and exploit it relentlessly. You remember the old saying, passed between sailors, a gap in your gear is a grave in the snow. Dark. Yes. Accurate. Unfortunately, also yes. You step out onto the deck, the boards creaking under your fur-lined boots. Even here, in relatively calm seas before the real ice begins, the wind slices between the masts and rigging like it's practicing for the main event. The layers do their job, you feel the wind, but you don't feel it in you, which is a small miracle worth noting. And yet, you're already aware of the trade-off. You move slower. Every step takes more effort. The sweat that builds up inside these layers during work is your next big enemy. Trapped moisture can freeze in minutes, turning comfort into catastrophe. Modern Arctic gear has clever ventilation zippers and moisture-wicking fabrics. You have wool that soaks and fur that holds, which means you're always in a balancing act between staying warm and staying dry. The sun is already low, though low in the Arctic is still unnervingly bright for hours at a time, and you find yourself pulling the hood tighter, wishing for that scarf-wrapped handle trick for your own face. Someone once joked that in these clothes, you're basically a very slow, well-insulated roast. It's only funny because you can't quite tell if they were serious. As you cross the deck, you catch the reflection of yourself in a cabin window. It's a strange sight, like a figure from another world, or a walking pile of pelts. But beneath the humor of it, you feel a flicker of pride. Every stitch, every seam, is part of a system that's been honed by necessity and survival. Somewhere in the layering of wool and fur, you've joined a tradition that stretches back through centuries of Arctic travelers, each one bundled against the cold, each one hoping the clothes would be enough. You've got the layers on, but without the right shell, you're just a very warm sponge. That's where the oilskin comes in, a thick, heavy outer layer that's been soaked in linseed oil until it's practically armor against rain, sleet, and the kind of sea spray that freezes before it hits the deck. You pull the jacket down over your parka, and it makes a sound halfway between a rustle and a crunch, like paper that's been left in the sun too long. The smell is distinctive. Sharp, earthy, a little like a painter's workshop collided with a fisherman's shed. You try not to think too much about the fact that the oil will eventually stiffen into a crust, especially around the seams, making the coat more like an exoskeleton you have to break into every morning. Still, out here, the smell and stiffness are small prices to pay for dryness. Historians still argue whether oilskin or rubberized Macintosh fabric was better. Rubber kept water out but tended to crack in the cold, while oilskin stayed flexible but smelled like you'd been marinated. The trousers matched the jacket, thick canvas, oiled until the color is somewhere between dark mustard and old candle. The cuffs tie with drawstrings to seal around your boots, and you've learned to double knot them because the Arctic wind has a nasty sense of humor about loose ends. You once saw a shipmate's untied cuff scoop up a whole bucket's worth of snow in a single gust. Over your hands go mittens with oilskin shells, a truly awkward compromise between grip and dryness. You can hold a rope without it turning into an icicle in your palm, but good luck trying to untie anything smaller than a hawser. Somewhere in your chest is a pair of thin leather gloves for fine work, but you only wear those when the weather is merciful, which is to say, almost never. The real trick of oilskin, though, is maintenance. You keep a small tin of linseed oil and beeswax mixture in your gear, and every few weeks, sooner if there's been heavy weather, you smear the garments down like you're basting a roast. It's messy work. Your hands get tacky, your sleeves pick up every bit of stray lint, and you smell like furniture polish for hours. But the difference between reproofed and neglected oilskin is the difference between shedding water and wearing a portable sponge. The hood is the final piece, large enough to cover even your fur-lined cap, with a stiff brim to deflect drips away from your face. It doesn't stop the wind, exactly, but it breaks it enough that the snow doesn't sting as much when it hits. A quirky tidbit you've picked up from older sailors: they sometimes rubbed the brims with candle wax to make the snow slide off faster. You tried it once and ended up with an oddly festive, slightly scented hood that made you smell like a church service in a storm. It's not just the clothes that get waterproofed. Before departure, you and the crew brush oil or pitch onto anything that can absorb moisture: packs, satchels, even the canvas on the deck hatches. One particularly ambitious man once tried oiling his wool socks. They became waterproof all right, but also unwearable, solidifying into something that could probably deflect musket fire. On deck, you can always tell when a squall is brewing, not from the clouds, but from the subtle shift in everyone's stance as they tighten hoods and check oilskin seams. A tear in this gear is no small thing. Once water gets in, it stays in, and wet clothes are like a slow poison in these temperatures. You've patched your coat more than once, usually with mismatched scraps from a retired set of trousers, giving your jacket the look of a particularly thrifty quilt. Historians have a lingering debate about whether explorers over-relied on oilskin, thinking it could replace good seamanship and preparation. You've seen both sides. Oilskin buys you time and comfort, but it doesn't make you invincible. In a real storm, the sea still finds its way in, seeping through sleeves, creeping down your back, pooling in the folds of your trousers until you feel like you're wading waist-deep in your own gear. Still, there's a ritual satisfaction in shrugging into the jacket before stepping outside, fastening each toggle with deliberate care, knowing you're wrapping yourself in a century-old method of staying dry. The surface might be old-fashioned, but the principle is timeless. Keep water out, and you might just keep life in. The ship groans as the bow hits a wave, sending a fine mist of spray into the air. You watch it bead and roll off your sleeves, glistening briefly before sliding away. For a fleeting second, you feel untouchable. Then a gust whips around the hood, sending a needle of wind right down your collar, and you remember, oilskin or not, the Arctic always gets the last word. You turn toward the hatch, oilskin crackling softly as you move. Somewhere in the shadows below deck, the chest waits with its neat compartments, the layers beneath the shell ready for the next time you peel it all off and let the cold air touch you just long enough to remind you why you bother with the ritual at all. You pull the hood tighter and keep walking, each step a creak of canvas and the faint, stubborn smell of oil following in your wake. You crouch by your chest and pull out the most delicate cargo you own, your navigation kit. It rides in a sturdy wooden case lined with green baize, the kind of box that could be mistaken for a gentleman's portable chess set if not for the faint smell of brass polish and salt. This is your lifeline in a landscape where every horizon looks like a postcard someone forgot to color in. The sextant comes first, gleaming in the lamplight like a piece of jewelry that decided to get a practical job. Its arc is carefully marked, the vernier scale tiny enough to make you squint even in good light. You cradle it as though it's made of spun sugar, because one good knock and the instrument will be as trustworthy as a politician's promise. Historians still argue whether brass or early alloy sextants held up better in polar conditions. Brass resisted corrosion, but alloys were lighter, and weight starts to matter when you're juggling gloves, wind, and freezing fingers. Beside it lies your compass, a sturdy dry-card model in a wooden housing. The needle twitches lazily, and you can't help but glare at it. Near the magnetic pole, compasses turn into sulky liars, sometimes spinning for no reason, other times refusing to move at all. This is where the sketch maps come in, thin sheets of paper already curling at the edges, drawn in charcoal and ink by explorers who came before you. The maps are a mixed blessing. Some are works of art, meticulously detailed coastlines with shaded mountains and dotted routes. Others are vague to the point of comedy, an entire inlet labeled simply ice, possibly dangerous. You've learned to read between the lines. If a mapmaker drew nothing for a stretch of coast, it's probably because the ice floes kept him from getting any closer. Or, possibly, because he was chased off by an irate walrus. Your dividers and parallel rulers are wrapped in a bit of oilcloth to keep the damp from rusting them. The dividers are for measuring distances on the chart, the rulers for transferring bearings from compass to paper. They don't look like much, just simple tools, but in the hands of someone who knows what they're doing, they're the difference between finding a safe channel and finding a sudden, ship-crushing shoal. A quirky detail you've picked up from older navigators: they sometimes scratch tiny notes directly onto the wooden compass box, wind directions, cloud patterns, even odd animal sightings, like a personal shorthand log. You've started doing it yourself, though your entries so far include less poetry and more "don't trust that iceberg, it moves." Nestled in the case is also your pocket chronometer, a heavy, well-made timepiece in a brass case. You wind it carefully each morning, guarding it from knocks and sudden chills, because accurate time is the invisible partner to navigation. One shipmate, a cheerful pessimist, likes to joke that if the chronometer stops, we might as well just start rowing south until we hit something green. There's also a battered spyglass, the leather wrapping cracked from years of cold-induced brittleness. You extend it slowly, the joints sticking slightly, until the lens catches a sliver of distant ice. Through the glass, everything looks sharper, crisper, the world reduced to manageable frames. Unfortunately, the same Arctic glare that makes the view so clear also makes your eyes water in seconds. You squint anyway. Using all this gear in the field is a special kind of juggling act. Imagine trying to hold a sextant steady while the deck rocks, the wind howls, and your breath turns into a personal fog machine. You've done it on calmer days, aligning the sun or a bright star with the horizon, scribbling down the angle before your fingers go numb. The calculations that follow, those you do below deck, with the chart spread out and the chronometer at your elbow. Historians still argue whether polar explorers relied too much on European navigation methods, ignoring the traditional wayfinding knowledge of the Inuit, who could read ice patterns, bird migrations, and even snowdrift shapes. You've seen the truth of it. In places where the maps fade into guesswork, it's often an old hunter's advice that keeps you off the rocks. Back on deck, you test the compass again, comparing it to the angle of the sun. It's still off by a few degrees, which you note in your log, a scrawled entry that future historians might find and debate over, imagining your exact location on this frozen chessboard. The irony isn't lost on you. Centuries from now, someone might argue over whether you were here or there, while you're standing right here, squinting into the cold wind. You tuck the instruments back into their box, each in its precise place, the hinges closing with a click. Then you slide the box under a bench, lashed to the hull so it won't shift in heavy seas. You've seen a sextant tumble in a storm once, the arc bending just enough to ruin it. The owner looked like someone had stolen a piece of his soul. Out here, navigation is part science, part art, and part sheer nerve. You plot your course with the best tools you've got, knowing full well the ice might decide it has other plans. And yet, there's comfort in the ritual, the slow, deliberate movements of measuring, marking, and checking that makes the chaos outside the ship feel, for a moment, like something you can chart. You slide the navigation kit back into its nook and reach for something far more blunt, your hunting rifle. It's a solid, dependable piece, a percussion lock musket modified for the cold. The stock is dark walnut, polished smooth by years of use, and the barrel is kept spotless, not because you're vain about shine, but because a speck of rust could mean the difference between a clean shot and a misfire. Out here, a working gun is both dinner ticket and insurance policy. The rifle rides in a leather case lined with felt to keep the frost from settling directly on the metal. It smells faintly of oil and old powder, a scent that never really leaves no matter how often you clean it. You keep the powder horn beside it, the brass spout capped tight to keep the damp out. The powder itself is double-bagged in oilcloth. Moisture is the sworn enemy of ignition, and Arctic moisture is the kind that gets ideas about freezing your eyelashes together. Historians still argue whether explorers carried more weapons for hunting or for defense. On paper, the rifle's for seals, birds, or the occasional caribou if you're inland. In practice, you've seen men keep one within arm's reach at all times because a polar bear can close the distance between spotted and in your face in less time than it takes to swear. A bear's curious inspection of a camp can quickly turn into the kind of encounter that has you sprinting for the rifle rack. The ammunition pouch is a small but weighty thing, slung over your shoulder with a thick strap. It holds lead balls, spare percussion caps, and a short ramrod in case the one under your barrel ever bends. In a side pocket is a curious little item, a brass bullet mold. You can melt down spent lead over a fire and cast fresh shot, though in the Arctic, melting anything outside is a delicate act of defiance against the cold. Cleaning gear is tucked in alongside the ammo, a metal rod with a brush, patches of flannel, and a tiny tin of gun oil. The oil thickens in the cold, so you keep the tin near the stove whenever possible, warming it until it runs like liquid again. More than one explorer has ruined a rifle by letting the oil freeze into a sluggish sludge inside the mechanism. You've learned to fire wearing mittens, though it's more of a thumb and forefinger pinch than a proper grip. A quirky trick you picked up from an old trapper is to sew a slit in the trigger finger of your right mitten. In emergencies, you can slip your finger through without taking the mitten off entirely. It's not elegant, but it's faster than fumbling with frozen cloth while your target waddles away. The first time you hunt in the Arctic, you notice how sound behaves differently. The crack of the rifle echoes across the ice like it's ricocheting between invisible walls. Birds erupt from snowbanks in a blur of white and grey. Seals slip into the water with a splash that's swallowed almost instantly by the vast quiet. Out here, a single gunshot can be heard for miles, which is both useful for signaling and a reminder that you're never truly alone. You remember reading that some 19th century expeditions brought absurd amounts of ammunition, hundreds of rounds for every man, only to find most of it still in the cases years later. Historians still argue whether this was over-preparation or just a reflection of how unpredictable the Arctic was. You tend to think it's like bringing too many blankets. You'll regret having less, but you'll never regret having more. On deck, the rifle is lashed securely when not in use, wrapped in its felt case. The ship's roll and pitch are bad enough without a loose firearm sliding into someone's ankles. You've also learned to keep it slightly above the deck, on a raised rack, so that melting ice and snow can't creep into the barrel. Your hunting kit also includes a small skinning knife with a bone handle, worn smooth in the palm. It's not for combat, it's a tool, meant for cutting hides, slicing meat, and, when necessary, prying open the lid of a tin when your fingers are too cold for finesse. Once, early in your Arctic days, you joined a shore party to hunt seal for fresh meat and blubber. The memory is mostly wind and glare, crouching behind a rise, breath fogging, waiting for a seal to rest too long on the ice. The shot was quick, clean, and the work after was messy, your mittens stiff with cold by the end. That day, you understood why every explorer spoke of the rifle not as a weapon, but as a multi-tool for survival. It's not romantic work, and it's not always successful. Sometimes you return empty-handed, the cold making every step heavier, the rifle's metal biting through your gloves when you forget to keep moving. But even then, there's a comfort in having it slung over your shoulder, a reminder that if the ice traps you, you're not entirely at the mercy of what the cook doles out from the tins. You rest the rifle back into its case, secure the powder, and loop the strap of the ammo pouch around the chest handle where you'll find it quickly. On a ship where space is a premium and every item has to earn its keep, the rifle earns its place 10 times over. From the solid weight of the rifle, you shift to something lighter, but no less vital, the blubber lamp. You lift it carefully from its shelf, a shallow, curved stone dish with a spout at one end, blackened from years of use. The lamp looks ancient because it is. The design hasn't changed much in centuries, borrowed directly from Inuit tradition. You can almost imagine it in a snow house instead of a ship's cramped galley, throwing the same warm, wavering light. You tip it gently, feeling the congealed slickness of seal oil still coating the inside. In warmer weather, the oil moves like heavy syrup, but here in the Arctic it sits stubborn and semi-solid, needing coaxing near a stove before it will pour. You keep a small reserve of wicks, twisted moss or cotton scraps, stored in a tin to keep them dry. The wicks are what give the lamp its slow, steady burn, the flame lapping at the oil without ever flaring up like a candle. Historians still argue whether blubber lamps were a better choice than the whale oil lanterns some expeditions brought. Whale oil burns cleaner, but seal oil is easier to come by when you're iced in. You tend to favor whatever keeps you from fumbling in the dark, especially when you're trying to navigate a deck full of sleeping men without tripping over a stray boot. Lighting the lamp is an act of patience. First, you warm the oil enough to loosen it, then set the wick in place so one end rests just at the edge. A quick touch of the flint and steel, a tiny flare, and the flame catches, burning low and yellow. It's not bright, never enough to read comfortably, but the glow feels alive in a way no candle does. The smell, though, is less poetic, a thick, fishy tang that clings to your clothes and hair until it's part of you. You remember your first week on a polar voyage, when you thought the smell would drive you mad. Now it's just background noise for the nose, mingling with wet wool, damp wood, and the faint metallic scent of the stove. In fact, you sometimes welcome it, proof that the lamp is working, that heat is still being made in the middle of a frozen ocean. A quirky tidbit: some sailors swore that sleeping near a blubber lamp kept frostbite away from their toes. Whether it was the heat or just the placebo effect is anyone's guess, but you've noticed your own feet feel less like blocks of wood after a night near one. You've also noticed that the lamp's oily soot can be rubbed into boots to add a last-minute waterproofing layer, messy, but effective. The downside to blubber lamps is that they're always hungry. Once lit, they burn steadily until the oil's gone, which means you're constantly topping them up. This becomes a particular kind of gamble in rough weather. Try pouring oil into a small stone dish while the ship pitches, and you're likely to end up wearing more than you feed the flame. More than once, you've heard a muffled curse from across the cabin followed by the distinctive thump of a sailor wiping oil from his trousers. When the lamp's fuel starts to run low, the flame shrinks to a pale whisper, barely holding on. In the Arctic night, that moment feels almost like a warning: keep feeding the fire, or risk letting the cold take its place. You never let it go out without good reason. Even in daylight, the lamp's presence is a comfort, a small defiance against the emptiness outside the ship's hull. Sometimes you carry it with you, shielded in a small wooden frame with mica windows to protect the flame from the wind. The frame rattles faintly when you walk, like the heartbeat of something alive. More than once, you've found yourself watching the flicker for far longer than necessary, lulled by its steady rhythm, letting the movement of the ship and the crackle of the wick blur into a sort of half-sleep. Historians still argue over whether lamps like this were more psychological tool than practical necessity on long voyages. You can't see it as one or the other, they're both. Without light, the endless night becomes an enemy. With it, you have at least the illusion that you've tamed the darkness. By the time you set the lamp back in its spot, the air in the cabin is warmer by a few degrees, the shadows softened just enough that the corners no longer look like open mouths. You wipe a smudge of soot from your fingers onto your trousers, just another stain in a world where everything already looks worn. Outside, the wind sighs against the hull, but inside, your small pool of light holds steady. You lean over your chest again, this time pulling out a roll of stiff canvas bound with twine. It's your medical kit, though kit might be too generous a word. The thing looks more like a bundle of mismatched sewing supplies than the life-saving collection it claims to be. You set it on the table, untie the cord, and unroll it slowly. Inside are the tools and remedies that stand between a minor mishap and a full-blown Arctic disaster. First, the basics. Bandages in varying states of cleanliness, some linen strips so old they've gone a permanent beige. There's a pair of scissors, their blades dulled from cutting more rope than fabric, and a set of sewing needles for closing wounds, a process you try not to think about unless it's absolutely necessary. The needles ride in a bit of cork, their points darkened with old sterilizing soot from being passed through a flame. Nestled among these is a small pewter syringe, the plunger a little stiff from the cold. It's meant for flushing wounds, though its other use, according to one old shipmate, is to squirt vinegar at anyone too slow in the morning. You keep yours clean and vinegar-free, but you appreciate the creativity. The glass bottles are where the kit gets interesting. There's laudanum for pain, smelling faintly of licorice and regret. There's tincture of iodine, its stopper crusted with reddish crystals from evaporation. You also have a bottle labeled spirit of camphor, which claims to cure everything from frostbite to melancholy, though experience tells you it's mostly good for smelling so sharp it makes your eyes water. Historians still argue about whether Arctic expeditions relied too heavily on folk remedies, especially when proper medical training was scarce. In your kit, the line between science and superstition is blurry at best. You've got powdered willow bark for headaches, a pouch of dried mint leaves for stomach upset, and, tucked in a corner, a curious lump of resin someone swore could be chewed to keep the cold away. You've tried it, it tastes like you licked a pine tree and does nothing for the temperature. There's also a small brass mortar and pestle, battered and dented but still functional. It's for grinding herbs, though more often than not, you use it to crush rock-hard sugar lumps when the cook isn't looking. The smell of the pestle tells its history, traces of mint, garlic, and something vaguely medicinal that might once have been cloves. Your forceps are crude but serviceable, the kind you hope never to need except for splinters. Unfortunately, ship life ensures that splinters are as common as snowflakes. You've pulled shards of wood out of your own hands so many times you can do it without wincing, well, almost without wincing. A quirky tidbit you picked up from another explorer, the bandages sometimes double as makeshift tea strainers. It's not hygienic, but in a pinch, a boiled cloth strip keeps the grit out of your mug. You've done it once or twice, washing the strip afterward, though you're not entirely convinced it ever becomes truly clean again. One of the more unusual items in your roll is a tiny folding saw, meant for removing damaged sections of bone in the event of a serious injury. You've never had to use it, and you'd be perfectly happy if you never did. Just holding it makes you uneasy. It's the sort of tool that comes with too many grim stories. The last compartment holds what you've come to think of as your morale medicines. There's a small tin of lemon drops for sore throats, a packet of cloves to chew for toothache, and a tiny, carefully corked flask of brandy labeled for emergencies. The brandy's been in there long enough that you suspect the definition of emergency is getting broader by the day. Historians still debate whether such kits were more about keeping the crew calm than actually curing them. You've seen firsthand how the mere sight of a bandage being applied, or the smell of iodine in the air, can convince a man that is already on the mend. Sometimes the ritual matters more than the treatment. When you're finished checking the contents, you roll the whole bundle back up, tie it with the same twine, and slide it into the side of your chest. Out here, the medical kit isn't just for battle wounds, it's for the small, constant wear and tear of living in a place that seems designed to chew people up. Splits in the skin from cold, burns from touching hot metal in the galley, frost-bitten fingertips from underestimating the wind, all of them patched up as best you can, with whatever's in reach. The thought lingers as you shut the chest. In the Arctic, survival often comes down to the simplest things: a strip of cloth, a few drops from a bottle, a superstition wrapped in linen. And maybe, just maybe, a lemon drop in your pocket for later. You dig deeper into the chest and your fingers close around a tin so solid it could double as a blunt weapon. You haul it out with a grunt. It's heavy, and that's because it's filled with tinned meat. Next to it is a cloth sack of hardtack biscuits, the stuff sailors have been cursing since the age of sail. Together, these two are the backbone of your rations, a combination that can keep you alive for months, though they won't win any awards for culinary excellence. The tinned meat is a relic of the industrial age's great promises. Sealed in steel and soldered tight, it's supposedly immune to time itself. Historians still argue whether the tins used on 19th century Arctic expeditions were safe. Some had faulty solder containing lead, and there are plenty of grim tales about explorers getting sick from their own dinner. You choose to believe yours are safe, partly out of optimism, partly because you don't have a better option. The label on one tin still clings to the metal, a faded illustration of a cow, looking far too cheerful for its own fate. You pry the lid off with your knife, the metal curling back with a squeal. Inside is a dense, salty block of beef in its own jelly. It's not appetizing, exactly, but the smell is reassuring in a strange way. Meat that still smells like meat after months at sea is something of a miracle. Hardtack, on the other hand, has no smell, no mercy, and no shame. The biscuits are thick, pale, and so solid you could roof a shed with them. Sailors used to joke that the only thing harder than hardtack was the ice around the ship. You've learned to soften them by soaking in hot tea or broth, though you still risk finding a stowaway weevil in the middle. A quirky tidbit: some men carve little faces into their biscuits before eating them, a kind of gallows humor that makes the chewing slightly more entertaining. You keep the hardtack in a canvas bag, tied tight to keep the damp and the inevitable pests out. The bag smells faintly of flour and salt, and when you shake it, the biscuits clink together like crockery. On bad weather days, that sound can make you feel both comforted and vaguely resentful at the same time. Your ration plan is simple: a measured portion of tinned meat, a couple of biscuits, maybe some tea if the galley stove's running. On special days, you break out the small jar of mustard tucked in the corner of your chest. A smear of it transforms the meat from barely tolerable to slightly tolerable, which in the Arctic counts as a luxury meal. There's a rhythm to ration life, one you didn't understand until your first long voyage. You start with variety, mixing tins of beef with tins of mutton, maybe even some vegetables. Weeks in, it all tastes the same, and you find yourself daydreaming about fresh bread or an apple so vivid you can almost smell it. Historians still debate whether Arctic crews under- or overpacked food. Some expeditions returned with untouched stores, the men too busy hunting fresh game to bother with tins. Others ran out entirely, relying on emergency caches left in cairns along the coast. You've decided there's no such thing as overpacking when the ice can trap you for months. Occasionally, you try to get creative with the rations. One evening, you crumbled hardtack into a pan with chunks of tinned beef and a splash of tea, letting it simmer into a kind of stew. It tasted edible, but the real triumph was how it made the cabin smell for an hour: warm, savory, almost like a home kitchen. The galley is where ration magic sometimes happens. The cook, a man who claims he once baked for a duke, swears he can make pudding from hardtack, sugar, and condensed milk. You've tasted it, and while pudding might be generous, it's sweet enough to make you forget the cold for a moment. That moment alone is worth the effort. You also carry a small tin of dried fruit, a treasure you ration out with almost ceremonial care. A single raisin can feel like a burst of summer in your mouth, and you're convinced the crew would mutiny if they knew you had it. The tin stays buried under your spare socks, out of sight, out of mind, at least until a day comes when you need that reminder of warmth. When you finish sorting the rations, you set aside tomorrow's portion and stow the rest back in the chest. The tins clunk against each other, the biscuits settle with a muffled thunk. Outside, the wind whistles against the hull, and you know that while fresh food is a dream, these heavy, simple stores are your reality. You pat the chest closed, thinking of the old saying, "You can't eat gold, but you can eat hardtack." In the Arctic, that's truer than anywhere else. Your hands find the bundle of cooking gear next, battered, blackened, and smelling faintly of smoke and seal fat no matter how often you scrub it. The portable stove is the heart of the set, a squat iron contraption with legs that fold in awkwardly, like it's perpetually bracing for a storm. It runs on blubber oil or coal, whichever you can scrounge, and the heat it produces is as fickle as the wind outside. Some days it roars like a miniature forge, others it sulks along, barely keeping a kettle warm. You haul it onto the table and test the hinges, still stiff but not frozen, which is a small victory. The fuel reservoir is dented in 2 places from a rough landing last season when a crate slid across the deck and decided to make friends with it. You've patched the seams with metal scrap and sealing pitch, and so far, it hasn't leaked much. The pans are thin iron, their handles wrapped in scraps of cloth to keep from scorching your hands. They double as makeshift repair plates for the ship's structure. Once, you actually hammered one flat to patch a gap in the galley wall, much to the cook's dismay. Historians still argue whether Arctic expeditions carried purpose-built cookware or just repurposed whatever was cheap and available. You can tell from the mismatched shapes in your kit which side of that debate this voyage belongs to. There's also a dented copper kettle with a lid that doesn't quite fit anymore. You've learned to balance a rock on top when boiling water, so the steam doesn't whistle too loudly and keep the whole crew awake. The kettle's inside is stained from endless tea and coffee. Well, coffer-like drinks made from roasted barley when the real stuff runs out. Tucked into a cloth bag are your utensils, though the word feels generous. A single long-handled spoon, a fork with one tine bent at a permanent angle, and a knife that's seen more rope cutting than food prep. A quirky tidbit, that bent fork tine is actually useful for prying open tinned goods, so you've stopped trying to straighten it. Cooking in the Arctic is its own sport. You have to keep one eye on the stove and the other on the thermometer. Boiling water in sub-zero temperatures takes far longer than you'd expect, and if the stove sputters out midway, you can end up with frozen soup before it hits the table. You've eaten meals that started hot and ended icy just by walking from galley to bunk. Fuel management is a constant puzzle. Blubber burns hot but leaves a smell that clings to your clothes, hair, and soul. Coal burns cleaner, but it's heavy to store and hard to find once you're away from supply routes. You've even tried burning driftwood scavenged from ice floes, a smoky, salty mess that made the kettle taste like shipwreck. The stove's best trick is its collapsible grate, which lets you set the pan closer or farther from the flame. It's not a precise science. You often end up holding the pan with mittens, leaning dangerously close to the heat, and hoping your eyelashes don't singe. Once, you singed your scarf and smelled like burnt wool for a week. Historians still debate whether cooking gear was standardized for naval expeditions or left entirely up to the crew. From your experience, it's the latter. If a man wanted to bring a porcelain teapot, he could, though it probably wouldn't survive the first ice-choked gale. You've learned to value metal above all. Dent it, scorch it, even drop it overboard, and it still might serve you again. The stove also doubles as your heating source when the ship's main systems falter. You've sat beside it for hours, just soaking in the warmth, the smell of tea mingling with blubber smoke, your mittens steaming gently after a long watch outside. On especially grim days, you'll heat a stone on the grate, wrap it in cloth, and slip it into your sleeping bag as a makeshift foot warmer. The frying pan has its own history, scars from overzealous cleaning, a warped bottom from too much heat, and the faint taste of every meal ever cooked in it. Fish, seal, biscuit fritters, even the disastrous attempt at flapjacks using powdered eggs that smelled faintly of sulfur. You still get teased about that one. When you're done checking the gear, you nest it all together, pack the stove legs tight, and tuck the bundle back into the chest. Outside, the wind rattles against the hull like it's trying to get in, and you feel an odd gratitude toward these simple tools. Without them, the tins and hardtack would just be cold metal and stone, not a meal, not a comfort, not the small miracle that hot food becomes when the Arctic night stretches endlessly on. Your fingers brush against something smooth and cool, wrapped carefully in oilcloth. You know the feel, it's the scientific kit, the tools that make this journey more than just survival. You peel back the oilcloth and reveal a jumble of brass, glass, and neatly labeled paper envelopes, each one a small promise to capture some secret of the Arctic before it swallows you whole. The most impressive piece is your brass sextant, its arc gleaming even in the dim lamplight. It's heavier than it looks, and its mirror catches the glow from the blubber lamp, flashing briefly like a wink. This instrument has guided ships for decades, measuring the angle between celestial bodies and the horizon. Out here, the horizon is a fuzzy line between snow and sky, so you do your best, squinting through the icy air and hoping your calculations aren't sending you to Greenland by accident. Next to it lies the thermometer, long, fragile, and suspiciously prone to freezing solid. Historians still argue whether the glass thermometers carried on 19th century Arctic expeditions gave accurate readings in extreme cold, or if their readings were as erratic as the northern lights overhead. Either way, you keep yours in a padded leather case, partly to protect it and partly because you dread the day you accidentally sit on it. The specimen jars are small miracles of craftsmanship, thick glass with cork stoppers, some lined with wax, others with folded parchment labels. Right now, half of them are empty, waiting for whatever you find, strange mosses clinging to a rock, feathers from a bird you've never seen before, maybe even a lump of oddly colored ice that seems to hum in your hand. A quirky tidbit: the last expedition you heard of collected snow samples, brought them home, and found tiny bits of volcanic ash inside, carried all the way from Iceland. You also have a folding field microscope, its hinges worn but still smooth. Setting it up requires patience and steady hands, qualities that are hard to maintain when the ship lurches or your breath fogs the lens. Still, it's worth it. You've stared through it at delicate ice crystals, each one a world of geometry, vanishing seconds later when the warmth of the room melts them into nothing. Then there's your battered notebook, the unofficial half of the scientific kit. The pages are filled with sketches of coastlines, measurements of ice floe thickness, and notes about wildlife encounters. The pencil lead is dull from constant use, and you keep a tiny penknife in the same pouch for sharpening. Ink would freeze solid in this weather, but graphite holds steady, at least until the paper itself becomes too brittle. The compass in your kit is no ordinary sailor's compass. It's specially balanced to work closer to the magnetic pole, though you still can't trust it entirely. Sometimes it spins lazily, like it's bored with pointing north. That's when you rely on the sun, the stars, and a healthy amount of guesswork. Historians still debate how many crews were truly lost to faulty navigation, but the silence of certain vanished expeditions speaks volumes. Collecting specimens in the Arctic is its own ordeal. You have to strip off mittens to use delicate tools, which means your fingers go numb almost instantly. You've tried working in sealskin gloves, but they make you clumsy, and you once dropped a sample jar into a snowdrift so deep you never saw it again. Somewhere out there, a perfectly preserved bit of lichen is waiting for the thaw of the year 3000. Your favorite piece of the kit might be the calipers, simple brass arms with a smooth pivot. They're for measuring everything from animal tracks to ice thickness, and you've used them to compare shell sizes from clams you dug out of a tidal pool. It's a humble tool, but it makes you feel like you're part of some grand tradition of explorers cataloging the unknown. A strange detail about the kit: one of the specimen jars is filled, not with moss or feathers, but with tiny iron nails. You keep them there for lack of a better container, and because sometimes you need to make emergency repairs to crates, boots, or even the microscope hinge. The line between science and survival is thin out here. Sometimes the same tool serves both. When you repack the kit, you handle each piece with care. The brass sextant goes in last, wrapped in its cloth like a relic. Outside, the wind howls, and you think of the long white miles ahead, the data you'll collect, and the tiny, stubborn hope that these records will matter to someone, somewhere, long after you're gone. You reach down and feel the soft, dense weight of warmth, your bedding. Not just the sleeping bag, but the entire bundle of hides and blankets you've learned to arrange into something that keeps the Arctic's sharp teeth from biting too deep. The sleeping bag is an early kind, heavy canvas on the outside, lined with reindeer hide on the inside. The hair points inward, trapping the air you warm with your body. It's not the sort of sleek thing modern campers brag about. It's lumpy, awkward to roll up, and has a faint animal musk that no amount of fresh air will ever erase. Still, you crawl into it each night like it's the arms of an old friend you don't mind smelling a little weird. Alongside it are loose reindeer hides, tattered from years of folding, dragging, and shaking out snow. You lay them beneath you to stop the icy boards from leaching away your heat. Historians still argue whether Arctic explorers preferred reindeer hides over sealskin or bearskin for bedding. Each has its champions. You've tried sealskin once. It was warmer but somehow left you feeling damp, as if the cold had crept in sideways. There's also a wool blanket from home, its edges hand-stitched with a pattern you recognize from your mother's sewing basket. The blanket is more sentimental than practical, but you keep it in the middle of the stack, where your breath can't frost it over. A quirky tidbit: some explorers brought brightly colored blankets on purpose, not for warmth, but to break up the monotony of endless white when setting up camp. You've developed a bedtime ritual, though you'd never call it that out loud. You unroll the sleeping bag, shake out the hides, and tuck the wool blanket inside the bag so it's waiting like a surprise when you climb in. On the worst nights, when the wind is shrieking like it's got a vendetta, you heat a stone on the blubber stove, wrap it in cloth, and drop it down to your feet before sealing yourself in. The bag's fastening system is primitive, leather thongs you knot together. In the dark, with numb fingers, it's a slow and muttered process. Once you're tied in, you're committed. You don't want to open up unless you absolutely have to. One night, you did, and paid for it by letting a gust of icy air inside. You spent the next hour shivering and cursing in equal measure. The hides aren't just for sleeping. During long days in camp, you sometimes drape one over your shoulders like a shawl. The hair traps your own breath, making a warm pocket of air that feels like a private summer. On rare clear nights, you've even taken a hide outside, laid it on the ice, and watched the northern lights ripple overhead, half mesmerized, half wondering if you'd turn into a man-shaped ice sculpture by morning. Historians still debate whether the bedding of early expeditions was adequate for the conditions. Reading the accounts, you'd think some men were cozy while others barely survived. From your experience, it comes down to how you care for it, keeping it dry, shaking out frost, and never, ever letting it sit against the bare deck for long. Your pillow, if you can call it that, is a cloth sack you stuff with spare clothes. On nights when everything is damp, it's like resting your head on a cold sponge, but it beats the alternative, using your arm and waking up with a dead, tingling hand. Packing the bedding is an art form. The hides go in first, rolled tight, then the sleeping bag, then the blanket around it like a final layer of protection. You lash the whole bundle with rope, the knot's muscle memory now. You know that once the bedding is wet, you're in trouble. Wet hides freeze stiff, and thawing them takes more fuel than you can spare. As you stow the roll back in its place, you catch yourself thinking about tonight's sleep. Will the wind calm enough to let the ship rest quietly? Will you dream of warm kitchens and soft mattresses, or will it be another night of half-waking, ears straining for the groan of shifting ice? Either way, when the time comes, you'll burrow into that heavy, warm cocoon and let it carry you, for a few short hours, away from the cold edge of the world. Your next find is tucked into a corner, wrapped in sailcloth and tied with 2 meticulous knots. You know this bundle well, the tools of your trade as much as the sextant or the stove, your navigation charts and logbooks. The paper inside has traveled farther than most men will in a lifetime. You ease open the knots and unroll the bundle, revealing a stack of charts, their edges curled and softened by damp air. The Arctic's coastlines on these maps are a strange mix of precision and mystery, some bays and fjords carefully inked, others sketched with vague dotted lines where unexplored might as well read. Don't count on it existing exactly like this. Historians still argue whether these inaccuracies were due to honest error or the wishful optimism of cartographers working from second-hand reports. The inked lines are faded, and you've added your own pencil marks over time, soundings taken through holes in the ice, drift patterns noted on days when the wind played strange tricks with the current. A quirky tidbit: on one corner of a chart, there's a small doodle of a penguin drawn by some long-forgotten hand. You keep meaning to note that penguins don't live in the Arctic, but it makes you smile, so it stays. Beneath the charts lies your main logbook, bound in thick leather darkened by years of handling. Its pages hold the heartbeat of the expedition, position reports, weather records, ice conditions, and the occasional sardonic observation about the state of the crew's socks. The act of writing in it each evening is both ritual and anchor. It marks the passage of time in a place where the days and nights are more suggestion than fact. Your handwriting has grown smaller over the months, partly to conserve paper, partly because writing with cold stiffened fingers is like trying to draw with a stick in wet sand. Still, you take care with the important entries. You know these words might outlive you, possibly becoming someone else's historical reference, or, more grimly, a final record. The navigation tools that accompany the charts are simple but vital. There's the parallel ruler, worn smooth along the edges, and dividers with needle-sharp points for measuring distances. You keep them in a wooden case to protect them from the damp, though you suspect they've already begun to rust in secret places. The case also holds a small lead weight attached to a braided line, your makeshift sounding lead for gauging depth in nearshore waters. Working with the charts on deck is an exercise in patience. The wind tries to snatch them, the damp tries to warp them, and the cold tries to snap your pencil lead with every stroke. You've developed the habit of weighing down each corner with whatever's at hand, mugs, mittens, even a sleeping boot once. The logbook isn't just for official entries. In the margins, there are tiny sketches of the ice's strange formations, archways, towers, and shapes that look like they belong in fairy tales. On one particularly long night, you drew a series of tiny ships battling monstrous sea serpents. You claim it was 4-scale, though no one's buying that. Historians still debate how much detail these logbooks should contain. Some argue they should be bare-bones factual, others that they should reflect the human experience of the voyage. Yours leans toward the latter. It's as much about mood as measurement after all. Numbers don't quite capture the way a gale feels when it cuts through 5 layers of wool. You keep a smaller, personal notebook separate from the official log. This one holds your private thoughts, the things you wouldn't commit to the ship's record, the uneasy dreams, the moments of doubt, the petty irritations, and the flashes of beauty. The paper is thin, almost translucent, and you protect it by tucking it inside your coat during the day. When you pack everything away, you're careful to rewrap the charts in the sailcloth, tying the knots tight. You slide the logbooks back into their wooden case, feeling the weight of their words. Out here, paper feels like gold, fragile, precious, and dangerous to lose. Without these charts and records, you're just another ship wandering blind in a land of ice. Wedged behind a crate of provisions is the oddest part of your cargo, medical supplies. Not a chest of sleek steel instruments and neatly labeled bottles, but a motley collection of items that feel equal parts hopeful and desperate. You pull it forward, the wood creaking under your hands, and lift the lid. The smell hits first: camphor, alcohol, and something faintly herbal that reminds you of a garden in summer. Inside are glass bottles stoppered with cork and sealed with wax, each labeled in careful handwriting: laudanum, tincture of opium, chlorodyne. Some are meant to soothe pain, some to numb the mind, and a few could do either a little too well. Historians still argue whether these medicines saved more lives than they endangered, especially when dosages were more art than science. Alongside the bottles are rolls of bandages, some clean, others obviously washed and reused. Cotton is rare out here, so you hoard every strip, knowing that a ripped sleeve might one day be repurposed into a dressing. There's a bundle of lint for padding wounds, wrapped in paper to keep the damp out, and a packet of needles with black thread for stitching, flesh or cloth, depending on the need. A quirky item sits in the corner, a jar of bear grease, officially for treating frostbite and chapped skin. You've used it on your hands, your cheeks, even once on a particularly creaky hinge, though you doubt the ship's carpenter approved. The surgical instruments are few and blunt: a small saw, a pair of forceps, and a folding knife with two blades of different lengths. They're kept in a leather roll, oiled to ward off rust. You hope you'll never have to see them used for their more grisly purposes, but you know that out here, even a broken bone is a dangerous luxury. There's also a bottle of quinine, bitter as regret, meant for fevers. You keep it wrapped in cloth so it doesn't rattle in the box. Next to it are two small tins, one filled with powdered mustard for making poultices, the other containing something the label simply calls restorative salts. Whether that means it will restore your health or just your willingness to keep walking is anyone's guess. One small brown bottle has no label at all. The ship's surgeon, if you can call him that, claims it's his own concoction for winter ailments, which is vague enough to cover anything from a chest cough to bad morale. He guards it like treasure, doling out drops only when he deems it necessary. In the top tray is a stack of folded paper envelopes, each containing dried herbs: chamomile for calming, willow bark for pain, and something called feverfew that you've yet to try. You've learned that hot herbal infusions are as much about the comfort they bring as any real medicinal effect. Historians still debate the wisdom of bringing such a varied, limited kit into the Arctic. Some argue that without more advanced surgical gear, you're only playing at medicine. Others note that in such isolation, even small comforts like a warm poultice or a drop of brandy can make the difference between recovery and decline. Your favorite part of the chest isn't the drugs or the bandages, but the little illustrated medical guide tucked into one corner. Its engravings are oddly genteel, as if every patient being treated were reclining gracefully in a Victorian drawing room rather than writhing on a creaking ship in sub-zero weather. You close the lid and secure the latch, aware of how quickly the kit's contents could dwindle if misfortune struck. Out here, the line between medical care and wishful thinking is thin, but you keep the chest close. Because in the Arctic, it's not just the cold or the ice that can undo you, it's the small, ordinary injuries and illnesses that, left untreated, can grow into calamities. Under the bench in your tiny sleeping quarters lies a row of lumpy canvas sacks, each tied shut with a frayed bit of rope. Inside them is something worth more than gold out here: spare clothing. Not glamorous, not even particularly comfortable by modern standards, but absolutely the difference between moving through the cold and freezing where you stand. You tug one open and pull out a wool sweater so thick it could probably stand on its own. It's scratchy enough to make you want to itch just looking at it, but it traps heat like a fortress. Historians still argue whether explorers in the 19th century preferred all-wool layers or mixed in cotton undergarments. You've learned the hard way that cotton holds damp like a grudge, and a damp shirt in Arctic wind is a direct invitation to hypothermia. There are long johns made of coarse flannel, the kind that come in one piece with a drop flap in the back. You joke about them being romantic, though the truth is they're just practical, less chance for drafts to sneak in. A quirky tidbit: some expeditions had long johns dyed bright colors, partly to cheer the men up, partly to make it easier to spot them if they wandered off into the snow. Yours are plain brown, which is probably better for morale than admitting you're wearing scarlet underwear. You pull out a spare pair of wool socks, marveling at how even unworn ones smell faintly of the ship's bilge. You've learned to rotate socks constantly, dry one pair under your shirt while wearing another, because frozen toes don't just hurt, they end journeys. Gloves and mittens come next. You've got thin wool gloves for handling ropes and instruments, and enormous fur mittens for when you need brute warmth more than dexterity. The mittens are lined with rabbit fur, soft as a whispered secret, and though they look ridiculous, you'd trade your sextant before giving them up. Scarves and balaclavas are rolled tight in the bottom of the bag. You have one scarf knitted by a neighbor back home, its edges uneven but its warmth unmatched. The balaclava, knitted in thick, oily wool, turns you into something that looks halfway between a knight and a bank robber. The outer layers are where the real battle with the cold is fought: heavy trousers lined with flannel, a parka sewn from sealskin, and a waterproof oilcloth overcoat. The parka is stiff in the cold, creaking like old leather, but the moment the wind cuts across the deck, you're glad to feel its weight on your shoulders. Historians still debate whether sealskin or canvas and wool combinations offered better protection. You suspect it depends on the weather and how long you're out in it. Tucked into the corner of one bag is your emergency set: a single pair of clean socks, a flannel undershirt, and a wool cap, all wrapped in oilskin to keep them dry no matter what. You've never used them, and you hope you never have to, because if you're down to your last dry clothes, something has gone very wrong. At the very bottom, you find a pair of leather boots lined with felt. They're stiff now, but with a bit of heat, they'll loosen enough to slip on. A note scrawled in the margin of your log once reminded you, never leave them too near the fire, or you'll have slippers by morning. As you repack the bags, you notice how much of your Arctic survival depends on fabric: wool from distant sheep, fur from animals you've never seen alive, cloth spun and stitched by hands far away from the ice. These garments don't just keep you warm, they carry the last warmth of home, stitched into every seam. In the lowest compartment of the storage locker, you find what might be the least glamorous but most life-preserving part of the expedition's gear: emergency survival items. These aren't neatly packed or particularly organized, they're a patchwork of just-in-case supplies, the sort of things you hope you never need but can't imagine leaving behind. The first bundle you lift is a coil of tarred rope, about as thick as your wrist. Its black surface leaves a faint residue on your gloves, and its smell, sharp, resinous, and faintly smoky, feels like security in a place where slipping into icy water could end you in minutes. Alongside it are a handful of iron spikes for anchoring lines into ice. Historians still argue whether early Arctic explorers overestimated how well these spikes would hold in certain conditions, but in your experience, they're better than nothing when the wind tries to shove you sideways across the floes. You find a battered tin box with matches inside, each head carefully dipped in wax to waterproof them. There's also a fire piston, an odd little device that uses compressed air to ignite tinder, along with a pouch of dry moss and curls of birch bark. A quirky tidbit: you once lit a fire using nothing but sunlight, a scrap of ice polished into a crude lens, and far more patience than you thought you possessed. It was a terrible cooking fire, but the bragging rights were priceless. There's a rolled oilcloth shelter, patched in more places than you'd like to admit. Alongside it is a bundle of sealing wax, good for mending both fabric and thin wooden panels in a pinch. You also find a small folding spade, its blade worn shiny from chopping ice blocks for the cook. The medical chest you saw earlier has a cousin here, a small survival ration tin. Inside are biscuits so hard they could be used as weapons, a lump of sugar the size of your fist, and a twist of tea leaves. It's not a feast, but you know the psychological lift of a hot drink in an endless white landscape can't be measured in calories. There's a small, heavy pouch filled with lead shot. Officially, it's for the shotgun in case you need to hunt birds. Unofficially, it's been used to weigh down tent edges in windstorms and even to sink a line through thin ice for fishing. Tucked at the very bottom is something you almost forgot you packed, a compact compass in a brass case, its lid engraved with a simple star. You don't rely on it for precise navigation. Magnetic readings this far north are their own special headache, but it's a reassuring thing to hold in your hand when the world feels like it's spinning under endless grey skies. Historians still debate the psychological value of these emergency kits, whether they truly prolonged survival or simply gave a man something to cling to when all other hope was gone. You've decided it's both. Even if the tools never leave the locker, the knowledge that they're there keeps a small corner of fear from growing too large. You repack everything slowly, aware that this is the last of the gear you've been walking through in your mind. The locker shuts with a thud, and for a moment, the ship feels smaller and quieter. You've seen the tools of warmth, navigation, nourishment, and healing, and now the last line of defense if all else fails. Your breathing steadies, your thoughts slow. The sound of the ship's timbers creaking is like a long, low sigh. You imagine the weight of your parka on your shoulders, the thick wool beneath, the smell of tarred rope and faint tobacco in the cold air. You picture the ice stretching away in every direction, pale under a low sun, the horizon soft as powdered sugar. Your boots crunch with each step, the sound muffled as if the world itself is holding its breath. You think about the gear you've handled tonight, the sextant, the stove, the socks, the logbook, and how each piece holds a quiet promise that tomorrow you'll still be here to use it. The Arctic is indifferent to those promises, but you keep them anyway. The rhythm of the sea beneath the ice is steady, patient. You let it carry you. The air in your lungs is cold but clean, and it feels like the day's weight is slowly sliding off your shoulders. Somewhere far above, the northern lights shift like green smoke, and the night closes around you, not in menace, but in an embrace. You're warm, you're prepared, and for now, you're safe.